I remember the exact moment everything started to crack. It wasn't when they lowered Kevin's coffin into the ground. It wasn't when people lined up to hug me, their voices soft and rehearsed, repeating the same hollow words like they were part of a script. "I'm so sorry. He was a good man. You must be so strong." No, it was when she leaned in. I hadn't noticed her before. Just another woman in black. Another face blending into the quiet blur of grief. But then she stepped closer, too close, and her voice dropped low enough that only I could hear it. "You don't know anything about him." I laughed. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. 18 years of marriage. 18 years of shared routines. Shared bills. Shared silence at the end of long days. I knew Kevin better than anyone. Or at least, I thought I did. But when I turned to look at her, she wasn't smiling. She wasn't crying either. There was something else in her eyes. Something calm. Something certain. She was watching me. Like she was waiting for something to land. And standing there, at my own husband's funeral, I felt something shift inside me, small at first, almost unnoticeable. A crack. A question I didn't want to ask. What if she was right? The cemetery was cold that morning. The kind of cold that didn't bite. It settled. It wrapped around everything and made it heavier. The sky was gray, flat, like it had no intention of changing. People stood in clusters, speaking in low voices. Kevin's co-workers were gathered near the back, dressed in dark suits, their expressions carefully neutral. When I glanced in their direction, a few of them looked away too quickly. That was the first thing that felt wrong. Kevin worked as a product manager. He had always described his job as demanding but predictable. Meetings, deadlines, product launches. Nothing unusual, nothing secretive. But the way his colleagues were acting, it didn't feel like grief. It felt like avoidance. I caught a fragment of conversation as I passed behind them. I didn't think she knew. The man stopped mid-sentence when he noticed me. The others fell silent instantly, like someone had flipped a switch. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quickly, his tone too sharp. Too controlled? I nodded, forcing a polite smile, even though my chest tightened. Knew what? I didn't ask. Not yet. I wasn't ready for the answer. I turned away, and that's when I saw her again, the woman from before. She stood slightly apart from everyone else. Her posture relaxed, her gaze fixed on me. Not on the coffin, not on the priest, and suddenly, a strange thought crossed my mind. Why does she look like she belongs here more than I do? I looked away, shaking it off. Grief does strange things, I told myself. It distorts everything. It makes you see patterns where there aren't any, but the feeling didn't leave. As the ceremony ended, people began to disperse slowly. Some came up to me one last time, offering condolences, touching my arm, holding my hand just a little too long. I thanked them. I nodded. I played the part. That's what it felt like, playing a role I didn't fully recognize. Because underneath it all, something else was growing. Not grief? Not yet. Something sharper. When I finally made it home, the silence hit me harder than anything else that day. The house felt too still, like it had been waiting for me to notice something I had missed. I set my keys down and stood there for a moment, staring at the living room. Everything looked exactly the same. The couch, the framed photos, the half-finished book Kevin had left on the coffee table. Normal. That was the problem. It all looked normal. I exhaled slowly and walked toward the bedroom. I told myself I needed to start organizing things, that it was practical, that it was necessary. But deep down, I think I was looking for something. I just didn't know what yet. I opened Kevin's closet and began going through his jackets, one by one. The familiar scent of his cologne lingered in the fabric, making my chest tighten unexpectedly. I reached into the pocket of one of his coats, and something small slipped out, hitting the floor with a soft metallic sound. I froze. For a second, I didn't move. Then I bent down and picked it up. It was a key. Not our house key. Not his car key. This one was different, smaller. Heavier. Attached to a plane. Unmarked tag. I turned it over in my fingers, trying to place it, and then I remembered a conversation from months ago. Casual. Forgettable. There's a storage unit, Kevin had said when I asked about some missing boxes. Just old stuff. Nothing important. Nothing important. I stared at the key again, my grip tightening slightly. If it was nothing important, why had he never shown it to me? Why had he never taken me there? The question from the cemetery came back, louder now. You don't know anything about him. I swallowed hard, my pulse starting to pick up. For the first time in 18 years, I felt something I had never felt in my marriage before. Doubt. I closed my hand around the key, holding it tighter than I meant to. I didn't know what I was about to find, but I knew one thing for sure. I was going to find out. I sat in the dark for a long time, the key still resting in my palm like it had weight beyond metal. I turned it over again and again, tracing the edges with my thumb, trying to convince myself it didn't mean anything, that it was exactly what Kevin had said, a storage unit. Old boxes. Nothing important. But something inside me had already shifted. If it was nothing, why had he never taken me there? I stood up abruptly, the movement surprising even me. My body had already made the decision before my mind caught up. I grabbed my coat, my keys, and walked out the door. The drive felt longer than it should have. The address had been easy to find, buried in one of the documents I'd skimmed earlier, something I hadn't paid attention to until now. An industrial district on the edge of the city. The kind of place you only went to if you had a reason. And I had one now. As I drove, the city changed around me. The familiar neighborhoods gave way to empty streets, warehouses, flickering streetlights. The further I went, the quieter it became. Even the radio seemed too loud. I turned it off. The silence settled in again. But this time it wasn't just inside the car. It felt like it was everywhere. When I finally pulled up, I almost missed the place. It didn't look like much. Just another row of storage units behind a rusted metal gate. The kind you'd pass without noticing. No signage. No movement. No indication that anything inside mattered. I sat there for a moment, engine still running, staring at it. This is ridiculous. I told myself. You're grieving. You're tired. You're reading into things that aren't there. But my hand was already reaching for the door handle. I stepped out. The cold air hitting my face sharper than before. The ground crunched slightly beneath my shoes as I walked toward the unit number I had memorized. Each step felt heavier than the last. The place was empty. No cars nearby. No voices. Just the distant hum of the city somewhere far behind me. And then, a strange feeling crept in. Like I wasn't alone. I stopped walking and turned slightly, scanning the area. Nothing. Just rows of identical metal doors and shadows stretching between them. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. You're imagining things. I kept moving. When I reached the unit, I stopped again. This was it. Up close. It looked newer than I expected. The lock wasn't rusted or worn like the others. It had been replaced recently. For something that was nothing important. Kevin had taken care of it. My chest tightened. I pulled the key from my pocket. My fingers colder now. Slightly unsteady. For a moment, I just held it there. I could still walk away. I could get back in my car, go home, and pretend none of this mattered. Pretend that the woman at the funeral was wrong. Pretend that everything I believed about my husband was still intact. But I already knew I wouldn't. I inserted the key into the lock. The metal scraped softly as it slid into place. I hesitated, my hand resting on it, feeling the tension build in my chest like something about to break. Then I turned it. The click echoed louder than it should have in the empty space around me. I froze. There it was again, that feeling. Like something had just shifted. And there was no going back. I pulled the handle slowly. The door creaked open. And immediately, I knew this wasn't a storage unit. The air inside didn't smell like dust or old cardboard. It was clean. Controlled? Intentional. I stepped in cautiously, my eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through a small overhead fixture. There were no stacks of forgotten boxes. No clutter. Instead, there was a desk, a chair, shelves lined with neatly organized folders, a laptop sitting closed in the center like it had been used recently. My heart started to pound. This wasn't a place to store things. This was a place to work. I moved further inside, my steps slow, almost careful, like I was afraid I might disturb something invisible. The walls caught my attention next. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. But as I got closer, the details sharpened. Photographs. Dozens of them. Pinned in clusters. Arranged in patterns I couldn't immediately make sense of. And in almost every single one, there he was. Kevin. Smiling. Relaxed. Alive in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. But he wasn't alone. She was in them too. The woman from the funeral. Hannah. My stomach dropped. I reached out and pulled one of the photos off the wall, my fingers trembling slightly. It was taken at a restaurant. I recognized the place instantly. We had gone there once, years ago, for an anniversary. But in this picture, Kevin wasn't sitting across from me. He was sitting across from her, leaning in slightly, smiling in a way that felt too familiar, too intimate. I flipped the photo over. A date was written on the back. I froze. That night, he had told me he was working late. A sharp, cold realization spread through me. I grabbed another photo, and another. Different places, different days, but the same pattern. Trips, dinners, moments, a life, a second life. And then it hit me. This wasn't recent. This wasn't a mistake. This had been going on for years. I stepped back, my breath unsteady now, my mind racing to catch up with what I was seeing. Every excuse, every late night, every business trip, they all meant something now. They all fit. I turned slowly, scanning the rest of the room, folders labeled by month, documents stacked neatly, a calendar pinned to the corner, filled with dates and notes. Everything organized, everything planned, nothing accidental. My gaze landed on a folder sitting slightly apart from the others. The label was simple, Mercury. I stared at it, a new kind of unease settling in. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about an affair. I didn't know what I was looking at yet, but I knew one thing. I hadn't just found out my husband was cheating. I had just stepped into a life that had been built carefully, deliberately, without me. I didn't leave. I should have walked out the moment I realized what that place was, what it meant. But my body wouldn't move. It was like something inside me needed to understand, needed to keep pulling at the thread even if it unraveled everything. I stepped closer to the desk. Everything about it was wrong. Not messy, not rushed, organized. Intentional. Like this wasn't a secret thrown together in panic. This was something Kevin maintained. Carefully. That realization hit harder than anything else. I reached for the top drawer and slid it open. Inside were folders, neatly labeled in handwriting I recognized instantly. Clean? Controlled? The same handwriting he used to write grocery lists or reminders on the fridge. Only this wasn't groceries. I pulled one out and opened it. Contracts. Invoices. Reports filled with numbers and marketing terms I barely understood. At first, it felt like reading a language I didn't speak. But then I saw it. His name, and right beneath it, hers. Hannah. Over and over again. I flipped through more pages, my fingers moving faster now. Signatures at the bottom. His signature. Hers right next to it. Dates stretching back further than I wanted to believe. This wasn't just an affair. This was a partnership. A business. I swallowed, my throat dry as I reached for another folder. The label read, Mercury, the same word I had seen pinned to the wall. I opened it slowly this time, something in my chest tightening as if I already knew this one mattered more. Inside were documents that looked official, structured differently. Ownership breakdowns, percentages, roles. Kevin's name, Hannah's name, equal. My vision blurred for a second as I tried to process it. They built something together. Not just a relationship. Not just stolen time and hidden dinners. Something real. Something that required planning. Trust. Commitment. Things I thought belonged to me. I forced myself to keep going. The next set of papers were bank statements. Multiple accounts. Different institutions. Some under Kevin's name. Some under variations I didn't recognize. And then, something that made my hand freeze completely. My name. I stared at it. My pulse suddenly loud in my ears. Emily Carter. Printed clearly on a document I had never seen before. I flipped the page. My fingers trembling now. Transfers. Large ones. Repeated over time. Moving between accounts I didn't know existed. Some labeled as consulting. Others with vague descriptions that didn't explain anything. But one pattern stood out. Money moving toward Hannah. Consistently. Regularly. For years. A sharp, sickening realization settled in. He wasn't just hiding money. He was building something with her. Investing in her. While I stayed home believing everything was fine, I pressed my hand against the desk, steadying myself as memories started crashing into place. Late nights. Canceled plans. Trips he said he couldn't avoid. All of it suddenly made sense. And somehow, that made it worse. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to breathe through the weight of it. When I opened them again, something else caught my attention. A laptop, sitting in the center of the desk. Closed. Almost like it was waiting. I moved toward it slowly and lifted the lid. The screen flickered to life. A login prompt appeared. Password required. Of course. I tried the obvious ones first. His birthday. Our anniversary. Variations of things that had once meant something to us. Nothing worked. I exhaled sharply. Frustration rising now. What else did you hide? I muttered under my breath. Then I noticed something. A file icon on the desktop. Partially visible even from the locked screen. The name was blurred, but I could make out part of it. Archive. Something about that word made my stomach twist. I reached for the keyboard again, trying one more combination. Still nothing. I leaned back slightly, running a hand through my hair, my mind racing. There was more here. I could feel it. Something deeper. Something Kevin hadn't wanted anyone to see. And then, a sound. Soft. Subtle. But unmistakable. Behind me, I froze. My heart slammed against my ribs as I slowly turned my head. The door. It had shifted slightly. Not wide open like before. Just moved. As if someone had touched it. I stood there. Completely still. Listening. Silence. Then footsteps. Light. Careful. Not leaving. Approaching. My breath caught as a figure appeared in the doorway. A woman. Younger than me. Late 20s. Maybe. Her posture tense. Her eyes scanning the room quickly before landing on me. We stared at each other for a moment. Neither of us speaking. Then she took a cautious step forward. You're Emily? Right. My body went rigid. How do you know my name? I asked. My voice sharper than I intended. She hesitated, glancing briefly at the documents scattered across the desk. She started, then stopped, like she was choosing her words carefully. I didn't think you'd be here. That doesn't answer my question. She swallowed. My name is Danielle, she said finally. I'm Hannah's sister. The words hit like a physical blow. For a second, I couldn't process them. Hannah's sister. Of course. Of course there was another connection. Another layer I hadn't seen. I let out a short, humorless breath. Of course you are. She didn't react to my tone. Instead, she looked nervous. Actually nervous. Her eyes flicked toward the door again. Then back to me. You shouldn't stay here, she said quietly. I laughed. But there was no amusement in it. I think it's a little late for that. She shook her head slightly, stepping closer but lowering her voice. No. I mean it. You don't understand what this is. I felt something shift again. Then explain it, I said. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like my husband built an entire life behind my back. Danielle's expression tightened. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she said softly. I stared at her. How long? I asked. She hesitated. Years. The word settled heavily between us. Years. I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting it sink in, even though part of me had already known. And you knew? I asked, opening them again. She nodded. Barely. I knew about them, she admitted. But not all of this. Not at first. I studied her face, searching for something. Guilt. Maybe? Or confirmation that she was lying. But what I saw instead was fear. Real fear. This isn't just about them, she continued, her voice even quieter now. You think it is? You think it's just cheating? Just lies. She shook her head. It's not. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean? I asked. She glanced toward the laptop, then back at me. He kept records, she said. Everything, in case something went wrong. My eyes narrowed. Records of what? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out something small, a USB drive. She held it out to me, her hand trembling slightly. If you want the truth, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, start here. I stared at it. Then at her. Why are you giving me this? Because, she hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the door again. Because I think you're already in this, whether you realize it or not. The weight of her words settled heavily in the room. I took the USB slowly, my fingers closing around it. What aren't you telling me? I asked. Danielle stepped back, already retreating. More than I should, she said. And probably less than you need. Then she turned and walked out, faster than she had come in, leaving me alone again. Alone with the documents, alone with the laptop, and now alone with something new. I looked down at the USB in my hand, my pulse steady but heavy. I thought I had uncovered my husband's secret. But standing there, in that room, I realized something far worse. I had only just begun. I didn't open the USB there. Something about the way Danielle had looked at the door, like it might open again at any second, stayed with me. I gathered what I could carry, shoved the folders back into place, and left the storage unit exactly as I'd found it. Almost exactly. The drive back felt different this time. Heavier. Like the city had shifted without me noticing. I kept checking the rearview mirror more than I needed to. Every car that slowed near me made my grip tighten on the wheel. It was irrational, I told myself. I was just tired, overwhelmed. But Danielle's voice wouldn't leave my head. You don't understand what this is. By the time I reached home, the sky had already darkened. The house greeted me with the same silence as before. But now it felt charged, like it knew something I didn't. I locked the door behind me, then checked it again, and again. Only when I was sure it was secure did I finally sit down at Kevin's desk, the USB resting in front of me. I stared at it. For a long moment, I didn't move, because once I opened it, there was no going back. I exhaled slowly and plugged it into my laptop. The screen flickered. Then a folder appeared. Simple. No password. No attempt to hide it behind anything complicated. That alone made my chest tighten. Kevin wanted this to be found. I clicked. The files loaded almost instantly. Organized. Categorized. Just like everything else I had seen in that room. But this time, it felt different. More personal. The first document I opened was a summary. Dates. Names. Transactions. Things I had already started to piece together. But then I noticed something else. Annotations. Notes written in Kevin's voice. Short. Direct. Almost like reminders to himself. She pushed this. Too fast. Need to slow down. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart beginning to beat harder. This wasn't just a record of what happened. This was a record of how it happened. I opened another file. Emails. Dozens of them. Back and forth between Kevin and Hannah. At first glance, they looked professional. Discussions about campaigns, clients, growth projections. But underneath it, something else. Pressure. Hannah's messages were sharp, focused, always pushing forward. We need to move on this now. You're overthinking it. This is the opportunity we talked about. Kevin's replies were different. Shorter. Hesitant. Let's review again. I'm not sure about the timing. Maybe we should wait. I felt something twist inside me. This wasn't the dynamic I had imagined. I scrolled further. The tone shifted over time. Hannah became more aggressive, more insistent. Kevin, quieter. Until finally, his messages changed completely. We need to slow down. This is getting risky. We can't keep doing this. My breath caught. I clicked into another folder. Financial projections. Contracts. Agreements I barely understood. But the pattern was clear. Expansion. Growth. Risk. Everything moving faster and faster. Until it wasn't sustainable. And then I saw it. An email flagged at the top. Subject line. Urgent. I opened it. If anything happens. Clean everything. No mistakes. No greeting. No signature. Just that. A chill ran down my spine. I leaned back slowly, my mind trying to catch up with what I was seeing. This wasn't just a hidden relationship. This was something dangerous. Something Kevin had gotten pulled into. Something he hadn't been able to control. I closed my eyes for a moment, pressing my fingers against my temples. Kevin, what did you do? I whispered. The question hung in the air, unanswered. But another thought followed quickly behind it. What was he trying to get out of? I opened another file, scanning through quickly now. Then another, and another, each one adding a new piece, a new angle, a new layer of complexity I hadn't been prepared for, until a sound broke through the silence. A soft vibration against the desk. I opened my eyes. My phone. Unknown number. My stomach tightened immediately. For a moment, I just stared at it. Then I answered. Hello. Silence. Just long enough to make my pulse spike. Then a voice. Calm. Controlled. Mrs. Carter. I straightened slightly in my chair. Yes. We need to talk about your husband's accounts. The words were precise. Measured. Like they had been practiced. I didn't respond right away. I wanted him to keep talking. There are obligations, he continued, that don't disappear when someone dies. A cold wave moved through me. Obligations. Not debts. Not issues. Obligations. I'm not sure I understand, I said carefully. Another pause. You've already started looking into things, he said. That's good. It means you're paying attention. My grip tightened around the phone. How do you know what I'm doing? He ignored the question. Your husband was responsible for certain arrangements, he continued. Those arrangements are now your concern. My concern. The words landed heavily. And if I don't agree? I asked. This time, there was no pause. You don't have to agree, he said calmly. But that doesn't change the situation. Not a threat, but close enough. I swallowed, forcing my voice to stay steady. What exactly do you want from me? Another small pause. Then, we'll be in touch. The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly, the silence rushing back in around me. But it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full, heavy, like something had just been set in motion. I looked back at the laptop screen. The files still open. The evidence still staring back at me. This wasn't just about what Kevin had done to me. This wasn't even just about Hannah. This was bigger. And whoever was on the other end of that call, they already knew I was part of it. I closed the laptop gently, my reflection faintly visible in the dark screen. I didn't panic. I didn't cry. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something else entirely. Clarity. This wasn't just something I had uncovered. This was something I had been pulled into. And whether I liked it or not, it wasn't over. The screen lit up again before I was ready for it. I hadn't moved from the desk. The USB was still plugged in. The files still open. Like they were waiting for me to stop pretending this wasn't real. I leaned forward slowly, my eyes scanning the folders again. This time, I wasn't looking like a wife. I was looking like someone who needed to understand exactly what kind of situation she had just walked into. The first file I opened was labeled simply, Accounts. Inside were spreadsheets, clean, structured, and disturbingly thorough. Dates lined up in perfect columns. Amounts moved with precision. Everything tracked. Kevin had documented everything. That was the first thing that struck me. This wasn't sloppy. This wasn't reckless. This was controlled. Intentional. I scrolled down. My breath steady but shallow. Account names I didn't recognize. Bank codes from different states. Even different countries. Transfers labeled with vague terms, consulting fees. Project costs. Operational expenses. And then I saw it again. My name? Emily Carter. Not once. Multiple times. I clicked into one of the entries, my fingers tightening slightly on the mouse. A transfer. Large. Far larger than anything that should have ever been connected to me. The description was minimal. No explanation. No context. Just a number. And my name attached to it. I sat back, my pulse starting to rise. Why would you do that? I whispered. Why would Kevin put my name on something like this? Unless it wasn't meant to be seen that way. I leaned forward again, scanning more entries. Faster now. Patterns began to emerge. Regular transfers. Monthly. Then bi-weekly. Then irregular. Increasing in size. Like something had accelerated. Like something had gotten out of control. And then I saw the recipient. Hannah. Over and over again. Different accounts. Same destination. Money flowing toward her like it had a purpose. Like it was building something. Not hiding. Building. I pressed my fingers against my lips, trying to steady my thoughts. This wasn't just financial betrayal. This was structure. Planning. Something long-term. I clicked into another file. Ownership. The word alone made my chest tighten. Inside were documents outlining percentages. Roles. Agreements. Kevin's name. Hannah's name. And then, mine. I froze. Not as a primary owner. Not even as a visible partner. A silent stakeholder. I stared at the document, my mind struggling to process it. I had been included. Without my knowledge. Without my consent. But intentionally, this wasn't an accident. It couldn't be. My eyes moved quickly across the page, scanning for anything that explained it. There was none. Just signatures. Kevin's signature. And Hannah's. Clean. Confident. Final. I leaned back slowly, my head spinning now. This could destroy me, I said under my breath. Not just emotionally. Legally. Financially. Everything. I opened another folder. My movements sharper now. Emails. Dozens of them. I skimmed quickly, looking for anything that stood out. Most were what I had already seen. Business discussions. Strategy. Growth. But then the tone shifted. Messages became shorter. More urgent. Hannah's emails pushed harder. We can't delay this. This is the window. You're overthinking again. Kevin's responses changed too. Slower. More cautious. We need to review. This doesn't feel right. I'm not comfortable with this level of exposure. Exposure. The word stayed with me. I scrolled further. Then I found it. A message flagged in red. Short. Direct. If anything happens, clean everything, no mistakes. My stomach dropped. I read it again. And again. No names. No signature. But the tone was clear. This wasn't a suggestion. It was a directive. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the screen as everything started to settle into place. This wasn't just business. This wasn't even just risk. This was something that could go very wrong. Something Kevin had realized too late. Something he had tried to slow down and failed. I closed my eyes briefly. Memories flashing through my mind. Late nights. Phone calls he took outside. The way he had started to withdraw. I thought it was distance. I thought it was stress. But it was something else. He was in over his head. A sharp sound cut through my thoughts. My phone. Vibrating again. Unknown number. The same one. I stared at it for a second. My heart steady now. Not racing. Then I answered. Yes. This time. There was no pause. You've been busy, the voice said. Calm. Controlled. But colder than before. I leaned back slightly in my chair. You seem to know a lot about what I'm doing, I replied. A faint pause. Then, you met with her today. My grip tightened on the phone. Danielle. They knew. They knew everything. I kept my voice even. You're watching me. We're paying attention, he corrected. That was worse. I said nothing. Let him speak. There are obligations, he continued. Your husband understood them. We expect the same from you. The same word again. Obligations. What exactly do you think I have? I asked. Another pause. Short. Measured. Enough to cause problems, he said. For everyone. My mind moved quickly now. They didn't know exactly what I had. Only that I had something good. That meant I still had an advantage. I don't think you understand the situation, I said carefully. No, he replied calmly. I think you don't. A quiet threat, wrapped in certainty. If you want to resolve this, he added, you'll be contacted again. The line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly, placing it on the desk without taking my eyes off the screen. They were watching. They were waiting. And they thought I was in the dark. I looked back at the documents, at the numbers, the names, the patterns. I wasn't in the dark anymore. I understood something now. Not everything, but enough. Enough to know that Kevin hadn't just left me with a broken marriage. He had left me in the middle of something dangerous, something structured, something controlled by people who expected me to play a role. I reached forward and closed the laptop gently. The room fell into silence again. But this time, it didn't feel overwhelming. It felt clear. They thought I was weak. They thought I would panic. They thought I would follow. I leaned back in my chair, my expression steady now. They were wrong. This wasn't just about what Kevin had done. This was about what he had left behind. And now, it was mine to decide what happened next. I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my head, the files, the call, Danielle's warning. Every piece clicked into place just enough to make the picture clearer, but not enough to make it safe. By morning, the fear had settled into something else. Focus. If Hannah was part of this, then she had answers. Maybe not all of them, but enough to matter. I sat up, reached for my phone, and found her contact information again. For a moment, my thumb hovered over the screen. Then I typed, "We need to talk." I stared at the message for a second before sending it. No explanation. No emotion. Just a statement. It was read almost immediately. That alone made my chest tighten. 3 dots appeared. Then her reply. Where? No hesitation. No confusion. Like she had been expecting this. I chose a place deliberately, a cafe downtown. Busy enough to feel public. Quiet enough to talk. She agreed within seconds. I arrived early. I always had, even before all of this. It was a habit Kevin used to tease me about. You plan for everything, he would say, smiling like it was something he admired. I pushed the thought away. The cafe was warm, filled with low conversations and the soft hum of machines. It felt normal, almost too normal. I chose a table near the window where I could see the entrance, and I waited. Every time the door opened, I looked up. Every time it wasn't her, I looked back down, my fingers resting lightly on the edge of the table. When she finally walked in, I knew immediately. Hannah didn't hesitate. She scanned the room once, found me, and walked straight over. Confident, composed. Like this wasn't the first time she had walked into something like this. She sat down across from me without asking. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I broke the silence. How long? No greeting. No introduction. Just the question. She didn't flinch. Long enough? She said calmly. That you probably should have noticed. The words landed exactly where she intended them to. Sharp. Precise. I felt it, but I didn't show it. I leaned back slightly in my chair, keeping my expression neutral. That's not an answer. She tilted her head just a fraction. Studying me? Years, she said finally. There it was. Out loud. Not hidden in documents or implied through patterns. Years. I nodded once. Slowly. Like I was confirming something I already knew. You knew he was married, I said. It wasn't a question. Of course, she replied. Her tone almost bored. No apology. No hesitation. Just certainty. Something inside me twisted. But I kept my voice steady. And that didn't matter to you. She leaned forward slightly, resting her elbows on the table. It mattered, she said. Just not in the way you think. I didn't respond. I wanted her to keep talking. She smiled faintly, like she understood exactly what I was doing. You were his routine, she said. I was his choice. The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were true, but because they were designed to hurt. And for a second, they did. But I let the moment pass. Because I wasn't here for that. I shifted slightly, changing direction. The company, I said. The accounts. For the first time, something in her expression changed. Just a flicker. But it was there. You've been looking, she said. Not a question. Answer me, I replied. She leaned back now, her posture shifting. We built it together, she said. That's all you need to know. That's not all I need to know. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You're stepping into something you don't understand, she said quietly. There it was. The same warning Danielle had given me. The same tone. But coming from Hannah, it felt different. Less fear. More control. I understand enough, I said. More than you think. I watched her carefully as I said it. And there it was again. That flicker. Small. Fast. But real. She didn't know everything I had. Good. You should be careful, she said after a moment. Her voice lower now. About what you open. Not concern. A warning. Or maybe a threat. I held her gaze. I think you should be more careful, I said. Just as quietly. About what you left behind. Silence settled between us. For a brief second, she didn't respond. Didn't move. Then she leaned back again, her composure returning, but not completely. You don't understand the people involved, she said. There it was again. People, plural. Not just her. Not just Kevin. Something bigger. I'm starting to, I replied. She studied me for a moment longer, like she was reassessing something. Then she stood up. The movement was smooth. Controlled, but faster than when she had arrived. A small detail. But it mattered. You should stop, she said, looking down at me. Before this gets worse. I didn't move. Too late for that, I said. She held my gaze for one more second. Then she turned and walked away. No dramatic exit. No final word. Just gone. I stayed where I was, watching the door long after it closed behind her. My hands were still steady. My breathing even. But something had shifted. Not outside. Inside. Hannah wasn't the center of this. She was part of it. A piece. Important, but not the whole. And for the first time since all of this began, I understood something clearly. This wasn't about confronting her. It wasn't about what she had taken from me. It was about what they were all connected to, what Kevin had been part of, what he had tried and failed to control. I stood up slowly, leaving the cafe without looking back. The city felt different now, sharper. Like everything had edges I hadn't noticed before. They thought I didn't understand. They thought I was still reacting. But they were wrong. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was learning, and the more I learned, the more I realized exactly how dangerous this really was. I walked out of the cafe without looking back. The door closed behind me with a soft click, but it felt louder than it should have, like it marked something permanent. The air outside was colder than before, sharper, and for a moment I just stood there, letting it settle into my lungs. Hannah wasn't afraid of me. That much was clear. But she had been careful, measured, and when I mentioned the files, when I let her see even a hint of what I knew, something had shifted. Not fear, not exactly, but something close to it. I started walking, not really paying attention to where I was going. My mind was already moving ahead, connecting pieces that didn't fit together before. Danielle's warning, Hannah's reaction, the voice on the phone. They weren't separate. They were part of the same structure, the same system. And somehow, Kevin had been in the middle of it. I reached my car and sat inside without starting the engine. The silence pressed in again, but it didn't feel empty this time. It felt full of unanswered questions. I pulled out my phone and opened the files again. This time, I wasn't looking for proof. I was looking for patterns, names, connections, anything that repeated. The first thing I noticed was how consistent everything was. Transactions weren't random. They followed routes, specific paths through different accounts, different entities, layered, deliberate. I zoomed in on one document, tracing a sequence of transfers. One name appeared more often than the others. Not highlighted, not emphasized, but there, again and again, attached to approvals, sign-offs, notes Kevin had left behind. Short ones. Delay. Not now. Too exposed. I stared at the name, my pulse picking up slightly. Whoever this was, they mattered. I searched for it in the other files. It appeared everywhere. Emails, agreements, financial summaries, always in the background, never explained. I opened one document labeled internal. Inside was a simple note. Do not contact directly. That was it. No explanation. No context. Just a warning. A quiet, controlled kind of warning that said more than any paragraph could. I leaned back in my seat, my mind racing. This wasn't just Kevin and Hannah making bad decisions. This was a structure with rules, with hierarchy, with people who operated behind the scenes. And Kevin had been close enough to see it, close enough to be pulled into it. I closed my eyes briefly, letting the pieces settle. Then the memory hit me. The last few months before he died, the tension in his voice when he took calls outside, the way he avoided certain conversations, the nights he sat in silence, staring at nothing. I thought he was distant. I thought he was tired. But now it made sense. He was under pressure, and I had never seen it. My phone rang. The sound was sharp, cutting through everything. Unknown number. The same one. I didn't hesitate this time. Yes, you've been making progress. The voice was the same. Calm. Controlled. But now it felt different. Closer. I've been reading what he left behind, I said. A pause. Not long. Just enough. That's not your role, he replied. I let that sit for a second. And what exactly is my role? I asked. Another pause. Then, to resolve what he started. The words were clean, precise, final. I leaned back slightly, my gaze fixed on nothing. You keep saying that, I said, but you still haven't told me what that actually means. You don't need details, he replied. You need compliance. There it was. Not a request. Not even a negotiation. An expectation. I felt something settle inside me. Not fear. Understanding. You're assuming I don't have options, I said. Silence. Then, you're assuming you do. His voice hadn't changed. But something underneath it had a warning. A test. I let the silence stretch between us. Then I spoke again. Slower this time. You've been watching me, I said. You know what I've seen. But you don't know what I have? Another pause. Longer this time. Good. That meant I was right. You should be careful, he said finally. The same words Hannah had used, but colder. You're not in control here. I almost smiled, because for the first time since this started, I wasn't so sure that was true. I think we both know that's not entirely accurate, I said quietly. Silence. Then the line went dead. I lowered the phone slowly, my reflection faint in the dark screen. They were watching, they were listening, but they were also uncertain, and that mattered. I looked back at the files, at the names, the patterns, the structure that had once been invisible to me. It wasn't invisible anymore. Kevin hadn't just left me a mess. He had left me information, and information was power. I started the car. My movements calm now. Deliberate. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about understanding the rules of the system I had been pulled into. Because if I understood the system, I could control how I moved inside it. And for the first time, I realized something that changed everything. They weren't just waiting for me to make a mistake. They were waiting to see what I would do. And that meant one thing. I wasn't just part of this anymore. I mattered. I didn't rush home. I drove for a while, letting the city blur past me, giving my thoughts space to settle into something solid. Panic would have been easier. Panic meant reacting, making quick decisions, hoping for the best. But I wasn't panicking. Not anymore. By the time I parked outside my house, I already knew what I had to do. I stepped inside, locked the door behind me, and went straight to the desk. The laptop was still there, waiting. The USB still plugged in like it had never left. For a second, I just stood there, looking at it. Then I sat down. If I'm already in this, I said quietly, then I'm not going to play it blind. I opened the files again, this time not searching randomly, not reacting to what I found. This time, I organized. I created a new folder, labeled it simply, Timeline. Every document I had, every transfer, every email, every name, I started placing it where it belonged. Dates first, then connections, then patterns. At first, it felt overwhelming, but slowly, piece by piece, something started to take shape. Not chaos, structure. Kevin hadn't been acting randomly. Neither had Hannah. And whoever was behind them definitely hadn't. Everything had a sequence, a purpose. And the more I arranged it, the clearer it became. They think I don't understand this, I muttered. That was their mistake. Because now I did. I paused, leaning back slightly as I looked over what I had built. And then another realization hit me. This was everything. All of it. Sitting on one device. One failure point. That wasn't good enough. I reached for an external drive from the drawer, plugging it in without hesitation. Then another. I copied everything. Every file. Every record. I uploaded encrypted copies to a secure cloud account I hadn't used in years. And then I did something I hadn't planned. I sent a copy to an email address I created just minutes earlier. No name. No connection to me. Just in case. If anything happens, I said under my breath, echoing Kevin's words. This doesn't disappear. I sat back again, my breathing steady now. For the first time, I wasn't just holding information. I was protecting it. And that changed everything. I closed the laptop and reached for my phone. There was one more thing I needed. Not answers, protection. I searched quickly, scanning through names until one stood out. A lawyer with experience in financial cases. Quiet reputation. No flashy headlines. Someone who worked behind the scenes. I called. The meeting was set for the next morning. The office was exactly what I expected: clean, controlled, nothing unnecessary. The kind of place where people said only what mattered. I sat across from him, a folder in front of me, my hands resting calmly on the table. "I need to understand my exposure," I said. He studied me for a moment, then opened the folder. As he flipped through the documents, his expression didn't change much, but I noticed the small things: the pause before turning certain pages, the slight shift in his posture. "This isn't simple," he said finally. "I didn't think it would be." He looked at me directly now. "Your name appears in several places," he said. "That creates risk." "How much risk?" He didn't answer immediately. "Enough," he said carefully, "that if this surfaces the wrong way, you could be seen as involved." The words didn't surprise me. I had already felt it. But hearing it out loud made it real. "And how do I protect myself?" I asked. His gaze sharpened slightly. "You don't react?" he said. "You control what becomes visible. And when—" I leaned back slightly. "Processing that. Control the timing. Control the narrative. That wasn't about defense. That was strategy." "I have everything," I said quietly. "Records. Names. Patterns." He nodded once. "Then your advantage is simple," he said. "They don't know what you have." A small silence settled between us. "And what do I do with that?" I asked. He closed the folder and slid it back toward me. "You decide when it matters," he said. "Not if— when—" I left the office feeling different than when I had entered. Not lighter, but clearer. Back in my car, I sat for a moment, looking at my reflection in the rearview mirror. They had assumed I would panic, that I would react, that I would try to escape. But I wasn't doing any of that. I was learning, adapting, positioning myself. And the more I thought about it, the more something else became clear. Hannah. She had been confident, controlled. But when I mentioned the files, she had hesitated. Just for a second. That meant something. It meant she didn't have full control. It meant she didn't know everything. And that meant she had weaknesses. I drove home slowly, my mind already working through the next steps. Not reacting. Planning. When I walked back into the house, it didn't feel the same anymore. It didn't feel like something I was losing. It felt like something I was leaving behind. I sat at the desk again, opening the laptop one more time. Everything was there. Organized. Protected. Ready? For the first time since the funeral. I wasn't looking for answers anymore. I had them. Now it was about what I was going to do with them. I closed the laptop gently, my fingers resting on the surface for a moment. They thought they were waiting for me to make a move. They thought I would react, but I wasn't reacting. I was deciding, and that meant I was already ahead. The courthouse felt colder than the morning air outside. Not physically, though the marble floors and high ceilings held onto a certain chill, but something deeper. Controlled. Structured. A place where emotions didn't matter unless they could be proven. I stepped inside, my heels echoing softly with each step, my reflection flickering in the polished surfaces around me. This wasn't like the cafe. This wasn't like the storage unit. This was different. This was where things became real. I paused for a moment at the entrance of the courtroom, my hand resting lightly on the door before pushing it open. Inside, everything was already in motion. Lawyers at their tables, papers being arranged, quiet conversations that stopped the second I entered. And then I saw her. Hannah. She was seated at the far end, surrounded by her legal team. Her posture was straight, her expression composed, but not the same kind of confidence I had seen before. This was different, more controlled, more guarded. For a brief second, our eyes met, and then she looked away. That alone told me more than anything she had said in the cafe. I walked to my seat without hesitation, placing my folder neatly in front of me. This wasn't about confrontation anymore. This was about control. The room settled as the judge entered. everyone rising in unison before sitting again. The sound of the gavel was sharp, final. And just like that, everything shifted. Hannah's lawyer stood first. His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of voice that could turn uncertainty into something that sounded like truth. He spoke about Kevin as an independent actor, a man who made his own decisions, a professional who entered into agreements on his own terms. Hannah, according to him, was nothing more than a collaborator, a business partner, someone who had trusted Kevin. Just as I had, I listened without reacting, my hands resting calmly in front of me, because I knew what was coming. When it was our turn, my lawyer didn't rush. He stood slowly, deliberately, as if the timing itself mattered. And then he began, not with accusations, with facts. Documents were presented, financial links established, patterns laid out one by one, each piece building on the last. No emotion, no drama, just clarity. And with each detail, the version of the story Hannah's lawyer had created began to crack. I glanced at her. She was still composed, but her fingers were no longer still. A small detail, but it mattered. Then came the moment everything shifted. Danielle. She walked into the courtroom quietly, her presence almost hesitant. But once she took the stand, there was no going back. I watched her closely as she sat down, her hands clasped together, her eyes flickering briefly toward Hannah before settling forward. The room felt different now, tighter, more focused. My lawyer began with simple questions. Her name, her relation to Hannah, and then, how long have you known about the relationship between Hannah and Kevin? Danielle hesitated, just for a second. Then she answered, years. The word landed heavily in the room. No ambiguity. No room for interpretation. Hannah's lawyer stood immediately, objecting, attempting to control the narrative. But it didn't matter. The first crack had already formed. The questioning continued. Danielle confirmed what I had already discovered, that Hannah knew Kevin was married, that their relationship wasn't accidental, that it had been built, deliberately, carefully. I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction. Not yet. But confirmation. This wasn't just my reality anymore. It was becoming everyone's. Then the questions shifted. From relationship to influence. Did Hannah play a role in Kevin's business decisions? Another pause. Longer this time. The tension in the room was palpable. Yes, Danielle said quietly. How? Danielle swallowed. She pushed him, she said. She encouraged him to take risks, to move faster than he was comfortable with. I saw it then. The shift. Hannah's composure faltered. Not dramatically. Just a slight tightening of her jaw. A brief flicker in her eyes. But it was there. For the first time, she wasn't in control. Her lawyer stepped in again, pressing Danielle harder now, trying to discredit her, to frame her words as personal bias. And for a moment, I thought Danielle might break. Her voice wavered. Her hands tightened. But then she steadied herself and continued. Emails were introduced. Documents. The same ones I had seen. The same patterns. Only now, they weren't hidden. They were official. Recognized. Validated. Truth. No longer confined to a screen in a dark room. Truth. Spoken out loud. Hannah's eyes dropped to the table. Another small detail. But it mattered. Because it meant something was slipping. The final question came quietly. Did Kevin ever express hesitation about continuing this arrangement? The room went still. Danielle looked down for a moment, then back up. Yes. What did he say? She took a breath. He said it was getting too risky, that he wanted to slow down. A ripple moved through the room. Subtle, but undeniable. It contradicted everything Hannah's side had suggested. It changed the shape of the story. Not completely, but enough. The judge called for a brief recess. The gavel struck again, and just like that, the room broke into movement. But I stayed where I was, still, calm, watching. Hannah didn't look at me. Not once. And that told me everything I needed to know. Because when we had met before, she had held my gaze without hesitation. Now, she couldn't. I leaned back slightly, my fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table. For the first time since this began, I wasn't chasing the truth. I wasn't searching. I wasn't reacting. I was watching it unfold, piece by piece, exactly as it was. Hannah had walked into this believing she controlled the narrative, that she could shape it, contain it. But that wasn't how this worked anymore. Because once the truth was spoken out loud, it didn't belong to her. It didn't belong to me either. It belonged to the room, and the room had already started to turn. I stood slowly as the others began to move, gathering my things without urgency, because I understood something now. She wasn't losing control because of anything I had done. She was losing it because the truth had finally caught up with her. I went back to the files that night, not because I needed more evidence, but because something still didn't make sense. I sat at the desk, the room quiet around me, the same way it had been every night since this started. The laptop screen lit up my face as I opened the USB again. My movement slower this time, more deliberate. I wasn't looking for what Kevin had done. I was looking for why. I scrolled through the folders I already knew, the documents I had already memorized, patterns I had already mapped out, names that no longer felt unfamiliar. But something pulled my attention to a folder I hadn't opened before. It wasn't labeled clearly, just one word: archive. I frowned slightly. I was sure I had seen it before, but I hadn't opened it. I clicked. The folder opened instantly. Inside were files that looked different from the rest. Not spreadsheets, not contracts. Audio files. My breath caught. There were several of them, each labeled with a date. The most recent one, just days before Kevin died. My hand hovered over the trackpad. For a second, I didn't move, because I knew this was different. This wasn't data. This was him. I pressed play. Static filled the room for a brief moment. Then, his voice. Low, tired, familiar in a way that hit deeper than I expected. Emily, if you're hearing this, something's gone wrong. I froze. Every muscle in my body went still. He paused, like he was choosing his words carefully. I don't know how much you've already seen, he continued, his voice strained. But I need you to understand something before you believe everything you're going to find. My throat tightened. I leaned closer to the screen, like that would bring him back somehow. This wasn't supposed to happen like this, he said. There it was, the same tone I had seen in the emails. The hesitation, the doubt. Hannah and we built something, he continued. At first, it made sense. It was opportunity, growth, control. Control. The word lingered. But it changed, he said quietly, faster than I expected. I closed my eyes briefly, listening. There are people involved, he said. People who don't care about limits, about consequences. My chest tightened. He knew. Of course he knew. I tried to slow it down, he continued. I tried to pull back. The same thing Danielle had said. The same thing the emails had shown. But by the time I realized what it had become, it was already too late. A silence followed. Heavy. Then, Hannah, he hesitated. She wasn't the problem at the beginning. But she wasn't going to stop either. I opened my eyes, staring at the screen. She saw what it could become, he said, and she pushed it there. The pieces clicked. Not cleanly, but enough. I made choices, Kevin continued. I'm not pretending I didn't. I crossed lines I shouldn't have crossed. His voice softened slightly. But I didn't want it to end like this. I swallowed, my hands tightening slightly on the edge of the desk. I moved things, he said. Accounts, assets. I felt my pulse spike. I put some of it in your name, he continued. My breath caught. Not to involve you, he said quickly, like he knew how it would sound. To protect it. To protect you. Protect me. I let the words settle, even though part of me resisted them. They can't touch everything if it's not where they expect it to be, he said. A strange mix of emotions rose inside me. Anger. Confusion. Something else I didn't want to name. I didn't tell you, he admitted. Because the less you knew, the safer you were. I let out a quiet breath. That didn't work, I whispered. The recording continued. If you're hearing this, he said, it means they're already looking. My eyes flicked to the window instinctively, even though I knew no one was there. You can't trust them, he added. Not Hannah. Not anyone connected to this. The warning felt heavier now. Real. They'll come for what they think belongs to them, he said. And they won't care how they get it. I sat back slightly, the weight of it pressing down on me. They don't know everything, he continued. That's your advantage. My mind sharpened instantly. Advantage. He had known. Even at the end, he had been thinking about this. About what came next. There's one thing, he said, his voice lowering slightly. One document they don't know about. My attention locked in. It's buried in the agreements, he said. A clause. Hidden. Easy to miss unless you know where to look. My fingers moved instinctively toward the keyboard. If you find it, he said, you'll understand how to stop them. A pause. Longer this time. Like he was running out of time. I'm sorry, he said finally. The words were quiet. Simple. I never meant for you to be part of this. The recording cut off. Silence filled the room. I stared at the screen, my reflection faint in the dark space around the file. For a long time, I didn't move. Kevin wasn't innocent. That much was clear. He had made choices. He had built something behind my back. But he hadn't been in control. Not completely. And at the end, he had tried to leave something behind. Not just a mess. Something I could use. I leaned forward slowly, reopening the documents. This time, I wasn't just reading, I was searching. For the clause. For the detail he had hidden. For the one thing that could shift everything. They think they're coming to collect, I said quietly. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. They have no idea what I have. I exhaled slowly, my thoughts clearer than they had ever been. This wasn't about understanding anymore. This was about action. Because now, I finally saw the full picture. And more importantly, I knew exactly where to look. The house was quiet again. Not the kind of silence that pressed in on me like before, but something softer, still. Like everything that needed to be said had already been said. And what remained was just space. I sat at the desk, the same place where I had spent nights chasing answers, chasing pieces of a life I didn't know existed. Now, everything was in front of me, organized, understood, finished. I leaned back slightly, letting out a slow breath. For the first time since the funeral, I wasn't angry. That surprised me more than anything, because I had every reason to be. Kevin had lied to me, built something behind my back, created a life that didn't include me, even while standing next to me every day. And yet, it wasn't that simple anymore. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the memories settle into something clearer. He wasn't innocent, but he wasn't entirely what I thought he was either. He had made choices, bad ones, risky ones, but somewhere along the way, he had lost control. And when he realized it, he had tried, in his own way, to fix it. Too late. But still, I opened my eyes again, staring at the files on the screen. Hannah. For so long, I thought she was the center of everything. The reason my marriage had fallen apart. The person who had taken something from me. But now, she looked different. Not smaller. Not weaker. Just not everything. She was part of it. Important. Yes. But not the whole system. And destroying her wouldn't destroy what she was connected to. I leaned forward, resting my elbows lightly on the desk. Because That was the truth I had been circling for days. I could take everything I had, the files, the emails, the recordings, and burn her world to the ground. Expose everything. Publicly. Completely. There would be no recovery from that. Her career, her reputation, everything she had built. Gone. The thought sat there. Heavy. Real. And for a moment, it almost felt satisfying. But then something else followed. Quiet. Clear. If I did that, what would it change? The system wouldn't disappear. The people behind it wouldn't vanish. And me, I would still be tied to it. Still part of the fallout. Still standing in the middle of something I didn't want to belong to. I leaned back again, letting that settle. This isn't the way, I said quietly. The words felt certain. Final. I didn't need to destroy her. Not to win. Because she was already losing. I had seen it in the courtroom. The way her composure cracked. The way she avoided my eyes. The way her control slipped. Piece by piece. Without me having to force it. Consequences were already unfolding. Without me pushing them. I reached for the folder my lawyer had prepared. Flipping it open slowly. Everything was there. Clean. Legal. Structured. The claims I needed. The protections I deserved. The separation I had to secure. Not revenge. Resolution. I signed the final document without hesitation. The pen moved smoothly across the paper. The ink settling into place like it had always been meant to. That was it. That was my move. Not explosive. Not dramatic. But decisive. I closed the folder and set it aside, my hands resting lightly on the desk. For a moment, I just sat there, listening to the quiet, thinking, not about what I had lost, but about what I had kept. Myself. That was the part that mattered. Later that afternoon, I saw her again. Not up close. Not in a confrontation. Just across the street. Outside a building where we had both been before. Hannah stepped out. Her posture still straight. Her expression still controlled. But something was different. Subtle. The way she moved. The way she paused for just a second longer than necessary before getting into her car. Like she was aware of something she couldn't ignore anymore. She didn't see me. Or maybe she did and chose not to react. Either way, it didn't matter. I watched her for a moment longer, then turned away. No words. No final exchange. There was nothing left to say. Because the power had already shifted. Completely. I walked back toward my car. My steps steady. My mind clear. I didn't need answers anymore. I didn't need explanations. And I definitely didn't need revenge. Not the kind I had imagined at the beginning. Because real power wasn't about taking something from someone else. It was about deciding what you were no longer willing to carry. I opened the door, pausing for a second before getting in. 18 years. That's how long I had built my life around something I thought was real. And in the end, it wasn't. But I sat behind the wheel, my hands resting lightly, my reflection staring back at me in the glass. I'm still here, I said quietly. And for the first time, that felt like enough. I started the engine and drove away, leaving everything else exactly where it belonged. Behind me. The first morning in my new place felt unfamiliar in the best way. There was no silence pressing against my chest. No memories waiting in the corners of every room. Just light, soft and steady, spilling through the window like it belonged there. I stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by half-open boxes, and realized something simple. Everything here was mine. Not shared. Not compromised. Chosen. I moved slowly, unpacking without rushing, placing things where I wanted them instead of where they had always been. A glass on the counter, a book by the window, small decisions that felt bigger than they should have. I came across a framed photo near the bottom of one box. Kevin and me, smiling, a version of us that felt distant now. I held it for a moment, my fingers resting lightly against the glass. Then I set it aside. Not thrown away. Not destroyed. Just not needed anymore. That was the difference. I didn't feel the urge to erase the past. I just didn't need to carry it with me. I walked to the window, looking out at the street below. People moved through their lives without hesitation, without knowing anything about what I had just come through, and for the first time, that felt right. Because it wasn't my burden anymore. I thought about everything that had happened. The funeral, the storage unit, the files, the courtroom. Each moment had once felt overwhelming, like it was defining me, shaping me into something I didn't recognize. But now, they felt like something else. Lessons. Not gentle ones, not easy ones, but necessary. I had thought I lost everything. That was the narrative I held onto in the beginning. A marriage, a future, a sense of certainty. But standing here now, I could see it clearly. I hadn't lost everything. I had lost an illusion. And in its place, I found something real. I exhaled slowly, letting that settle. Kevin. For so long, his name had carried weight, anger, confusion, questions I couldn't answer. Now, it felt different. He had made his choices. He had built something without me. He had hidden things that should never have been hidden. But in the end, he had also left something behind. Not just a mess. Not just consequences. But a way out. A way for me to understand. A way for me to move forward. I didn't forgive him. Not in the way people expect. But I understood him. And that was enough. I thought about Hannah next. About the way she had looked at me across the table. Across the courtroom. Across everything that had unfolded between us. She had wanted control. Power. Something more than what she had. And in the end, she got it. Just not in the way she imagined. Because control comes with weight. And power comes with consequences. I didn't need to see how it ended for her. I already knew. People who build their lives on manipulation don't lose everything all at once. They lose it slowly, piece by piece, the same way they built it. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to be part of that process. That wasn't my role anymore. I turned away from the window and walked back into the room, picking up another box. Inside were things I had forgotten about. Old notes, receipts, small pieces of a life that used to feel permanent. I smiled faintly, setting them aside. Not everything needed to be kept. Not everything needed to be remembered. I paused for a moment, my hand resting on the edge of the box. After 18 years, he betrayed me, I said quietly, the words no longer heavy. They say revenge means taking everything back. I looked around the room again. The light. The space. The calm. I shook my head slightly. That's not what I did. Because I didn't take his money. I didn't destroy his world. I didn't chase the kind of ending that leaves everything in ruins. What I took back was something else entirely. My life. My choices. Myself. I closed the last box and set it aside. The room finally starting to feel complete. Not perfect. Not finished. But real, and that was enough. I walked back to the window one last time, letting the quiet settle around me. If you've ever had someone you trusted turn out to be someone you didn't recognize, then you already know how deep that kind of betrayal cuts. But I want to ask you something. When everything falls apart, what do you take back? Do you fight? Do you destroy? Or do you walk away and rebuild something that's actually yours? I didn't know the answer when this started, but I do now. And if this story meant something to you, if you've ever had to find your way back after losing everything, stay with me. There are more stories like this. Stories about truth, about strength, about what it really means to take your life back. I rested my hand lightly against the glass. My reflection steady now. Clear. I didn't take revenge, I said softly. I took back everything that was ever mine. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.